Our discussion, just to remind you, we were talking about the general concepts, right, which are included into the notion of folklore. And we said that historically, a lot of components of folklore were overlooked. For example, in the 18th century, still, when we were talking about folklore, started to study it, we were looking only at the oral tradition, right? Something that was obvious. So if you remember the components that we were talking about last time, those were the narratives that were looked at. For example, various songs, legends, fairy tales, perhaps a couple of idioms, but everything was very sporadic. And a large chunk of folklore was actually missing from the study, namely material culture, food, traditions, customs, right, houses, because for some reason it was not viewed as part of the cultural tradition. And everything got sorted only in the beginning of the 20th century, so it's quite late for the study. And in addition to that, we also realized that we are dealing with syncretism in folklore, right? So many of these components, right, genres of folklore do not exist independently. And we're developing together as a fusion, right, of various elements. And that's why we started to talk about primitive syncretism, because evidence from various studies of humankind show us that even if we're talking about language, the language, any kind of calls, right, signs, exclamations, developed within this syncretism. Namely, when people were doing something, they were accompanying these acts with some kind of vocal vocalization, basically, right, or some kind of sounds. And then through practice, with time, these vocal sounds of certain acts, right, of certain movements and certain mimicry receives a very stable association with that act, right? And that's how we have a development of a certain tradition, of a certain ritual, of a certain custom, right? So that is why when we start looking at different genres, we of course will have some kind of elements that are working only for this genre, right? You will not find it somewhere else. But quite often, I will also tell you, remember we look at those other ones, and we also saw similar symbolism, we saw similar practice, right? And it's working all the way back to that primitive syncretism. So that's, I believe, that's where we stopped, if I remember. Okay, so in addition, when we talk about folklore, we have to keep in mind a number of dichotomies that are important for this study. What is dichotomy? You're familiar with this? We like it. Dichotomy, it's like a contrast, right? Opposition. Certain elements that on one hand, on the opposite spectrum, but at the same working against each other within the same concept. So what are we talking about? And I believe we started to talk about collective authorship on one hand. Right? So on one hand, when we talk about folklore and we say, well, who creates this custom? Who creates these rituals? And we say, well, there's not one author, right? This all belongs to a certain group that uses this tradition, uses this ritual as a marker, as a sign of belonging, right? Or the existence of a certain group of people. That's on one hand. On the other hand, we also see not all, but many have professional performers that all they do is they perform pieces of folklore, right? Or they carry out, not necessarily those are the singers or musicians or actors, but they could be just usually in a group or of a certain tribe. Those people will be identified as a sort of the vessel of cultural knowledge, okay? So like a source of wisdom in that particular society. So we see many groups that have this, not all, but many have it. So on one hand, you have this collective authorship. On the other hand, you have individuals who are sort of responsible for keeping up the tradition, making sure that it continues, that it is alive for one thing, but also that it is continuous in a way which is judged the right way by the members of that society, by the members of this group, which is very interesting. And that leads us to another dichotomy. On one hand, folklore is all about creativity, right? All about distinct features that people use to mark themselves, right, as belonging to a certain group. So it's all about being distinct, it's all about being different, right? It's all about creating variation, it's all about sort of putting a stamp on the mark, just to say that we are, say, Germanic tribe, and that's because of that, that's what we do. Or we are a Slavic tribe, and because of that, that's the way we behave, right? And it seems like that should create abundance of variation, right? A lot of various developmental processes. But truth is, when we look at folklore, a lot of folklore is preset and formulaic. Depending on the genre, right? So depending on the type, what you look at, some of the genres, they're sort of 80% preset, meaning that a certain piece has to have a number of elements, and the elements should be, or symbols, in a certain order. And if you have any kind of deviation from it, then the members of that society will say, most of the time they say, this is not our piece, right? Or they don't want to identify with it. Or they usually say, judge it, make a judgment something along the line that that's just ill-made. And what's ill-made about the piece will be about certain custom or original, that it will have too much of variation, too much of the different elements, too many of them, right? Too much of the difference. Or it would not follow a formula which is already preset in the folkloric tradition of this particular group. Right? So what you will see that when we study various genres, I will be teaching you those formulas. Right? Remember that I said that not only I want to give you a set of what, but I also want to teach you to see why everything is there, what kind of symbolism is behind a particular imagery or order, right, or connection and association, and also what's behind it, right? Because it's this why that explains the influence of that image on the particular development of the particular group, why they do the things they do, and what drives this. Okay, so the second dichotomy was formulaic nature of folklore on one hand, and a lot of variation and creativity on another, right? And these two concepts are sort of working together against each other or together with each other. And last but not least is the dichotomy between stereotypes and personal identity, right? National identity. So on one hand, of course, no matter what the group you're working with, there will be certain stereotypes, right, that exist, preset, and they are usually connected with that outside viewer of that particular nation, right, of this particular group of people. And in our society, of course, nowadays we strive not to make any judgment based on the stereotypes, but at the same time, stereotypes exist for a reason. And interestingly enough, when we start to sort of dive into folklore, we see that members of the groups themselves use those stereotypes to identify themselves. Now, there is two types of relationship with a stereotype when you talk about identity, national identity. Some people will embrace it, right, and believe it or not, will make sure that they manifest this stereotype to the utmost degree, because for them that's how they read their membership. Basically, they will say, and if I share certain features of this stereotype or stereotype together, then that will be the best proof of me belonging to that group. The opposite way of taking it is when the personal national identity, right, of this one particular person, they will define themselves from the opposite of the stereotype. But still, they're using the stereotype, right? They're still using the same concept. It's just only they will strive to be as far as possible from it, but still working within the same concept. So you need to be very careful with folklore when it comes to a notion of a national identity. You need to remember that any kind of nationalistic movement usually is on the rise whenever a nation, any kind of society feels threatened, right? It feels that it's either on the brink of extinction or it's up against a certain change, and it fears that this change will be drastic or too drastic to its survival, or survival in the sense where they want to survive, right? And that's what's happening to a Slavic community right now. So it's been happening not just for this year or this last 10 years, it's been happening for several decades already, and influences every single Slavic subgroup that exists, and we will look at them in a second, and a whole variety of it. Since various Slavic subgroups feel uncertain about their future, some of them feel undermined, some of them feel misunderstood, some of them feel that they don't have enough of a material culture to back up that richness of the cultural development. Various reasons, it all depends on whatever particular Slavic group we're looking at. Then the natural way, and it's the innate instinct, that Slavs are not original here, many people do that, is go to your folklore as one of the main features that identify you as a distinct group, right? You sort of need to reestablish yourself, reevaluate yourself. How are you going to do it? You need to find something that defines you. And first and foremost, that comes to people's mind, there's going to be elements of folklore, either a system of religious belief, system of symbols, that is identified as important, one salient for a particular culture, and they're going to protrude it, right, at the utmost degree. So that's why, for that reason, neo-paganism, right, which of course embraces folkloric tradition, is on the rise in all Slavic cultures today. And those of you who are interested in it probably know that, unfortunately, many neo-pagan groups are prone to be extremist. And once again, the Slavic world is too diverse and complicated for the second year course and for the 2000 level course. But what you need to keep in mind at this introductory level, that anytime something like that happens, you need to understand the reason why it happens. Basically, it's because a culture feels threatened, and usually from outside sources, right? Non-Slavic sources. So basically, we're going to look in a sec at the map where Slavs used to be located and where they are located now, and you will see that they always have a lot of neighbors, and a lot of non-Slavic neighbors. And many of those non-Slavic neighbors are quite strong as far as their cultural and rich tradition, and of course their economic and political development. All that, of course, creates unstable situation for Slavic world, and then of course that explains the rise of nationalism in these countries, and the clinging to folkloric tradition, which is of course good for folklore because a lot of it gets revived, but bad, of course, for the balance, right, in human relationship, to get not only between groups, but also within each particular groups, because usually it is connected with a lot of stress, right, and a lot of tension, both between groups and inside of a group. So you have to keep it in mind. And the reason why I want you to keep it in mind is because when nationalism is on the rise and when it is supported by political power, right, which is strong, then all of it gets support from law, documents, education, and everything else, right? And as a result, we may have books which are not exactly true, because they are written within that nationalistic channel, right? And they have an agenda. And the agenda is to promote a culture that feels threatened, right? And feels like they need to reestablish themselves. They need to really evaluate the boundary, make sure that the boundary are strong and the features are distinct. And that's why we're talking about that neo-folklore even, where you have folkloric traditions are pre-selected. Some of them are sort of shunned away because they do not serve the agenda, and some of them are actually selected and developed further. So here, of course, it's really hard to judge which one is a natural folkloric development and which one is a development which is supported by, extra linguistic factors, right? Extra cultural factors, not folkloric development per se. So in this case, the Slavic world is a really difficult dragon to tackle, because it's so diverse and it's connected with so many tensions, especially right now. Okay, so that's just a general intro. But of course, we need to define Slavic groups. We need to talk about who Slavs are, where do they come from, where do they live, where they used to live. And here's the problem for this. Slavs did not have a tradition of chronicles, as many other cultures do, right? And they did not have a tradition of recording documents that would talk about the location, what tribes they live, right? Which cities are they cities, what they do, and where they go, because Slavs originally are not militaristic tribes. So usually a tradition shows that militaristic societies have a really good tradition of documenting what they conquer, right? Who they conquer, why they conquer, what the lands are. For example, Germanic tribes, right? You have a very strong tradition, or Romance society, right? Where you have Franks, right? Or Roman Empire, I'm sure you've heard of, Greeks. So they have a very good history of documents that helps us define the territory for a certain nation and reasoning for that territory. Slavs did not have that. So what do we know about Slavs and how do we know about Slavs? We have several sources how to know where Slavs lived. So first problem is, since Slavs did not have their own system of documenting that, we have to go to outside sources, of course. And the earliest documents that we find are 7th century AD documents that talk about approximately 5th century happenings. So when we talk about Slavic people, we can talk about them as distinct groups based on the evidence, only starting from 5th century AD. Anything earlier than that is just an idea, because it is not supported by any documents. And I'm telling you this because remember I just told you that many Slavic cultures feel threatened right now. So we have a large number of books that will tell you that Slavs existed as a separate, distinct group starting before Christ, right? Or, I don't know, came from Africa, or there's a lot. You have to remember that this is product of that national identity crisis, where cultures feel that they need to redefine yourself. When it comes to science, science likes numbers and documents and evidence. And what we have is, just like I said, the earliest documents that we can find, be it personal letters or certain chronicles or manuscripts or religious products, religious books. They date 7th century and they talk or relate to events that happened in the 5th century. So that is why traditionally we start history of Slavdom only in the 5th century AD. 5th century AD. When we are looking at the Slavic world, we see that it is surrounded by many strong kingdoms. Can you see it? Do you need to make it bigger? Look larger, perhaps. Okay. So here's your Europe in the 7th century. We're looking at the Europe in the 7th century, and we have a kingdom, another kingdom. And when they say kingdom, this is already a well-formed organization. And then all of a sudden, we have some kind of land, we have Slavs. Okay? So, Slavs, because there is no such kingdom as a Slavic kingdom, right? So like one country where all Slavs are united. They're not there yet. Okay? We don't even have cities when we say, okay, this city is a Slavic city, or this town, or this hill, or this forest is a Slavic. No, because we don't have any documents that support that. Okay? So, how do we know even that this kind of area is approximately where Slavs could be found? You have several sources, right? Several types of sources. On one hand, we have what we call linguistic contact. Lose my marker. What is linguistic contact?
Would it be contact with other kingdoms, like when the Slavs would, let's say, have a battle with another kingdom?
The problem is you're talking about a culture that does not come to have a battle, right? You have cultures that go for battles. And at that time, let's be just honest. Slavs get easily conquered. They just basically mow them down, or they run away, and they just change location because they're not a militaristic tribe altogether, right? There's not even a basis for it. Okay, but it's linguistic. What does linguistic mean? Language connected. Yeah. So why is it? It's not just a contact. I'm not telling you trade, right? I'm telling you linguistic contact.
They share similar words.
Exactly. So. We have borrowings, right? In other languages, in these neighboring languages, we see already, linguists help us with that. They say we find words that are Slavic words, right? And they know in their manuscript, in those neighboring cultures, in their neighboring cultures at the 7th century, we see that they are already using Slavic words, okay? So this linguistic context shows us that Slavs are already active right here, and they exist here, so that linguistic contact helps us. Another way of defining location for Slavs is toponymy. What is toponymy?
Geographical location of other kingdoms around.
Well, usually it's not about kingdoms. Usually it's just location about pieces of geography, such as rivers, hills, mountains, seas, right? Names of forests, and so on and so forth. This is the area where we find basically rivers, forests with Slavic names in them. Okay? Because usually what happens, of course, this is a human nature, we name things around us, right? We coin them. And then quite often when another culture comes, right, conquers, or just you have that a migration, or for whatever reason, quite often they just borrow those names. They do not rename them. We do have, it just depends on the culture. Sometimes they do rename them, but in these lands it doesn't happen, right? They were using already Slavic names, and Slavic names stay throughout the European and Asian parts for the really long time. So we know Slavs were there, right? Naming them. They may not be there now, but they used to be there. Or in some places they're still there. So toponymy really helps us to identify that location. All right. Of course, references from other cultures, right? Because maybe Slavs like to sit in a place and they do not move, and they did it. Slavs still do not love to move. They really like to sit at home. They believe this is the best place ever, no matter how cold it is. And they may not move, or not military so they do not go out or any kind of military battles, and they're not really big traders either, so that's why also they do not travel. But other cultures are, right? So they pass by this territory and they come in contact with a Slavic group, and then they have a tradition of either writing it in a letter or some kind of report or document, and through that we know that at this point we already have a tribe or a group of people that identify themselves as Slavs, and they are located approximately at this location. Okay? And last but not least is a method of exclusion, right? Method of exclusion. So, it may sound a little bit weird and not scientific, but when you have, even you do not have a lot of evidence, this also works. Basically, we studied everything in the area, all kind of evidence that we could find. Whoever claimed which territory, right? Which nation claimed which territory. And the territory which was not claimed, right? Scientists decide that it's not claimed for a reason, because there is somebody there, okay? And that someone most likely is a Slavic group, okay? Who unfortunately does not have a tradition of recording where it is that they locate yet, not yet. They will develop it later, but they don't have it at that point yet, okay? All right, so we do have this weird claiming to the land where we are. So if you look at this different, and of course I have all this map for you on the ELC. So if we look at the Slavic territory now outside, right? So forget about all those other kingdoms that surround Slavic tribes. So we sort of have this approximate area. And we also have a very good knowledge that Slavs loved rivers. They like settling near rivers, okay? And we have that, unfortunately it does not work today, but I will try to make sure that it will. I wanted to show you how we know it. It's because archaeologists did their work, and there was a lot of excavation of pottery, of human remains, of the remains of settlements that were there. And when you look at it, at the Slavic lands, you will find that most of them are around rivers. So you'll see like a lot of dots just surrounding those rivers, okay? So because of that, we have, once again, we do not have a certain claim where Slavs live, but we have three competing theories. And those theories are connected with rivers, okay? And the first theory says that original land of Slavs, I lost my Slav right here you go. So original place of Slav is this Dnieper, right? This is that river. So we don't have to fancy name for that theory, which is called the Dnieper theory, okay? Which basically say that original, here's the Dnieper, right? Original location of Slavs is along the Dnieper River, because we do find a lot of names, Slavic names here. We do find a lot of artifacts that we dug out, a lot of remains of settlements in this land. So we have a Dnieper theory. This is the original location of Slavs. Competing theory is Order Wisla or Vistula. You have different names for it. Order of Wisla. So this is also Wisla or Vistula. It's just one of the names. This river has many variants of name. Alright, so I'm looking at the map, and here's your Wisla, Vistula, that's your thing, and here's the order. So this theory says that original location of Slavs is in between the two rivers, right? Those are the first one. In between these two rivers. They are located between them because, once again, there's a lot of artifacts that claim. And we have a third. And guess what? Once again, it is connected with a river. And it is Danube this time. Danube River. And here's my Danube. And the third competing theory says that no, the original placement, location for Slavs was the Danube River. Okay. And now I'm gonna, remember I told you that there is actually a lot of Slavs. On the ELC, I'm offering you a map that tells you about 1/3 of groups of Slavs that we have. We have a lot of them. I'm not gonna bother you with names of the Slavs, but just one subgroup contains about 30 of them. But if you are interested, you're more than welcome to analyze that map. But what I will tell you is that all Slavs are divided in 3 main groups. Eastern Slavs, Western Slavs, and Southern Slavs. Eastern Slavs, Southern Slavs, and Western Slavs. Now, why do you think we do not have one theory that tells us exactly where Slavs are located? Instead, we have 3 competing theories.
There's evidence for all 3.
There's evidence for all 3.
Each different culture originated around each settlement
Precisely.
thing.
Archaeologists, folklorists, linguists of each precise subgroup work on their own subgroup. Remember I told you that folklore and identity are really closely connected, and folkloric tradition is quite often used in order to manifest any kind of ideas that the culture has in mind. Here it is. Who is original? Who is first? We are the first is the message. Who do you think supports the Dnieper theory? Eastern Slavs do, right? They work on that, and they will find and they will dig successfully everything that they can find in order to support that they are the original Slavs. Who do you think support the Dnieper theory? Southern Slavs do, because they are the one who want to claim that they are the original ones. They are these Slavs who matter. Same thing is happening with Wisla order theory. Western Slavs claim that no, they are the prototype of a Slavic land, right? Their land is the one. It's all connected with, of course, national pride and identity, and since all of them have evidence of Slavic settlements around the same time, we have to just objectively say, okay, there was 3 theories, 3 locations. Till we find more evidence, we should have to be dealing with that. This is the area, okay? And in order to make for you even more clear what we're talking about when we talk about Slavic groups, subgroups, here they are. So linguistically, sometimes Slavic group is united, put together with a Baltic group. We're not going to be talking about Baltic group. We're only focusing on Slavic groups. So linguistically, we divide all Slavs into groups: Eastern Slavs, Western Slavs, Southern Slavs. Right? Each subgroup also has different subgroupings. So if we talk about Eastern, we're talking about Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian. If we talk about Western, we're talking about Poles, Czech, Slovak, and Serbian. If we're talking about Southern Slavs, then we're talking about Serbians, we're talking about Croatians, we're talking about Bulgarians, Slovene, and Macedonians. Alright, so those are the Slavic subcultures. Remember, I hope you're keeping in mind that you have a due date on the 29th, right? So those are the Slavic cultures, right? When you're gonna tell me which subgroup you're interested in, you can either limit yourself to the Eastern, Western, or Southern subgroup, or you can specify me the particular language or the particular culture, subculture that you are interested in, say Poles or Bulgarians, right? Whatever it is that you would like to be working with, and it is up to you what you're going to select. Okay? Now, any kind of questions? Now, of course, this is already a present-day division. I looked, it's still around the same, no, this one is 1997, but this is the clearest picture I could find for you where you can actually get a good judgment of how big the groups are. And the balance is still approximately the same. So if we're talking about Eastern Slavic subgroups, then of course Russians is the biggest, largest subgroup there. If we're talking about Western, it's dominated by Polish subgroup. If we're talking about Southern Slavic subgroup, then Serbians and Croatians, those are the ones that sort of dominate the culture.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I see with most of these groups, you could relate them to like a modern day country, except for Sorbians. Where would like Sorbians be located?
Well, it's because you have a very unfortunate development of this group. You will find many Sorbians in Germany, and you will find some Sorbians in Poland, and some Sorbians in Czech Republic. Right, so they just got split between the countries, so you do not have a clear cut. You actually do not have that clear cut between languages or subgroups and countries in any case. So even if you look at Russian, yeah, so Russia is going to be dominant, but there's a lot of Ukrainians who live in Russia, a lot of Belarusians who live in Russia. So you do not have this one-to-one division. The same thing is happening in the case with Bulgaria and Serbia and the rest of the groups, right? So you have the dominance, but for example, many Czechs live in Poland, right, and vice versa. Anything else? Okay, so the last but not least is the term Slavs. Where does that term come from, and what does it mean? So folk etymology, which means not exactly a linguistic one, will tell you that Slavs connected with a word slave in English, and it's because they were enslaved, which is true. Since it was not a militaristic culture, they were enslaved by many other stronger cultures, and since Slavs did pride themselves for having a good health, they did have a really good hygiene from the start. That they would make really, healthy worker. But of course, Slavs would not name themselves a slave from the start. So this is what we call folk etymology, meaning some explanation created by people who are not specialists, right, in this. But what do specialists tell us? Why do Slavs name themselves Slavs? Of course, we have to go to a language, and we have to look at various words, roots that are common in Slavic languages, and we need to see what these words mean. Right? What do they represent? Okay? And when we come to this, various Slavic languages, we see several roots. We actually have 4 roots. We have a root Slava. And once again, since I have many people here who study Russian, I'm just gonna go ahead and write it for them because it's just easier for them to remember that. But they don't have to. If it's easier, remember it, because some other people ask me to do it. But if you don't care about this, just do this, okay? And slava means glory. Okay, glory, glorification, worship. Okay, so the idea is that Slavs call themselves Slavs because they glorified gods in the same way. Yes, they were diverse, so we see how many groups there were. But they realized that they're all, no matter how diverse they are, they have the same set of gods that they worship. And they continue to develop they continue to perform the same rituals, right? The same customs in order to glorify gods. So that's why they call themselves Slavs. Once again, so we don't have one manuscript that explains us why Slavs call ourselves Slavs. So we have competing theory. We also have a root Slova, which is also connected with Slavs. So we're trying to explain why Slavs call themselves Slavs. And Slova means word. People who support this variant, this theory, they say that Slavs, even though they had their own language, but they realized that these languages, they maybe not completely, but they are mutually intelligent. You know what mutually intelligent means? It means even though I hear that you speak differently, but I understand you to a 50%, right? Maybe not in all particulars, but the main idea, I still understand what you're saying. And if you look at modern day Slavic languages, if you know one, you will be able to pick up another, right? Not that you will be able to speak it, but you will find a lot of words, a lot of constructions very similar to the one that you have in one Slavic language, right? So basically, people who support this idea, they will say that Slavs realize that they all speak the same language, right? And it's actually linguistically that they define themselves as one group. Okay. Another root what we have is Slova. We do not actually have a word in Russian in it, but in Russian we have a word Sloboda, which means a free town. But the root Sloba means freedom. Okay? Freedom. And people who support this theory say that it's very interesting that on one hand, we say that Slavs are not a militaristic culture, right? That means that they were easily conquered. But at the same time, history shows us that there was not a single period of time in the history when all Slavs were conquered at the same time. Right? There was always a group that remained independent and had an ability to continue this tradition, the customs, and that is why many people say why Slavs are so strong in their culture. I mean, despite of our odds. And they inherit it really regularly. So what they say is it's that acknowledgement that despite all our shortage and the lack of defense that we have, there is always that outage where we can run to, right, to save ourselves and our culture, to preserve our cultural inheritance. Okay? And last but not least, Slava, with a capital S, is one of the names that we find for river Dnieper. Who do you think likes this theory? Eastern Slavs, exactly. Eastern Slavs love that theory. They will use it as another evidence to say, look, Slava is a name for the river that we settled in. That's one of the evidence that we are the first, we are the main ones, we are the original one. Okay? Because even the river is named. There's several variants of it. Sometimes it's Slava, sometimes it's Slavuta, but it's all referred to Dnieper. Okay, so Eastern Slavs, of course, pick that theory saying that this is one of the evidence, the originality, right, where all Slavs come from. But once again, since we do not have a document that we're going to base our decision on objectively, we have to work with competing theories, right? And that's where they are. Okay. Questions?
For the Eastern Slavic group that supports the Dnieper theory, don't they usually also connect that with the Christianization of the Kievan groups?
Remember, Christianization happened much later. Slavs existed way before that.
Right, but what I mean is, like, don't they like connect those two together? This is where we were born and that this is where we're baptized.
Let's save that, because next time we will be talking about Christianization and then how it influenced religious system of beliefs. Because it's much later. Slavs do not define themselves as by Christianization as the way European world does. It's a very different story. So the easy answer would be no, right? But there is also a longer story. I'm sorry?
Could you rewrite Slova?
Slova?
No, the one under the next one.
Slova?
Yes. Could you rewrite the Russian?
Why? S-L-O-V or the Sloboda. No, what I'm saying is we do not, in none of the Slavic languages actually have this word.
No, I'm just trying to learn the opposite, so I just want
Uh-huh.
to.
So it's an S, then L, O, V, O. Okay, I got it. You want the printed version. Anything else, guys? Have a wonderful weekend. Don't forget to come back on Monday.